What if the person you miss the most was never meant to stay long enough to become your future? Sit with that question for a moment. Don't answer it yet. Just let it sit somewhere behind your ribs, because by the end of the next 30 minutes, it's going to mean something completely different than it does right now. There is a moment that happens to almost every human being on this earth, a moment nobody warns you about. It doesn't come with thunder or lightning or some dramatic sign in the sky. It comes quietly, usually on an ordinary Tuesday, in the middle of folding laundry or driving home from work, when you suddenly realize that someone who used to be your entire world is gone. Not dead necessarily, just gone, absent, erased from the daily architecture of your life, the way a name gets erased from a whiteboard with the swipe of a hand. And in that moment, a question rises up in you that you cannot silence. Why did they leave? Why did it end? Why did the universe let this happen to me? Tonight, we are going to answer that question, but not in the way you expect. Because this isn't a story about loss. This is a story about the space that loss creates. And somewhere between the ache and the answer, you are going to see your own life differently than you've ever seen it before. Stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you might be the thing you've needed to hear for years. Let's start with pain, because pain is where all real stories begin. Think about the people who have vanished from your life, the friend who stopped texting back, the parent who grew distant, the love who once memorized your laugh and somehow forgot it, the version of yourself that used to believe forever was a promise, not a possibility. We don't talk enough about how strange grief is when nobody has died. We don't have rituals for it. There's no funeral for a friendship that quietly dissolved over 3 years of unanswered messages. There's no headstone for a marriage that ended not with a scream, but with a silence so complete it felt louder than any fight ever could. There's no eulogy for the version of you that existed before someone left and took a piece of your identity with them. This is the kind of grief that hides in plain sight. It shows up in empty chairs at dinner tables, in phone numbers you still haven't deleted, in songs you skip because they remember someone you're trying to forget. And underneath all of it is the same haunting question, whispered in the dark at 2 a.m. What did I do wrong? But here is where the story begins to shift. Here is where we step back from the pain just far enough to see the larger shape of it. Because sometimes the ending of something is not a punishment. Sometimes it is not proof that you were unworthy or unlovable or somehow broken. Sometimes an ending is simply life doing what life has always done since the beginning of time. Changing, moving, making room. Picture for a moment a forest in late October. The leaves do not fall because the tree has failed. They fall because the tree, in its ancient wisdom, knows that it cannot carry everything through winter and still survive to bloom again in spring. The falling is not death. The falling is preparation. It is the tree understanding something we spend our whole lives trying to learn, that holding on to everything, always, eventually costs you the very thing you were trying to protect. Let me tell you about a woman named Elena. Elena was 34 years old, and for 9 years she built her entire identity around a man named Daniel. She met him in her 20s, in a coffee shop in Chicago, on a rainy afternoon that felt at the time like the beginning of every good thing that was ever going to happen to her. They built a life together, an apartment with mismatched furniture, inside jokes that made no sense to anyone else, a future they had already started sketching out loud, the way people do when they believe forever is guaranteed. And then, on a Sunday morning that started like every other Sunday morning, Daniel sat across from her at their small kitchen table and told her he didn't love her anymore. He didn't shout, he didn't cry. He simply said the words, and then he packed 2 suitcases, and by that evening, the apartment that used to feel like a home felt like a museum of a life that no longer existed. For 8 months, Elena asked herself the same question every single day. What did I do wrong? She replayed every conversation. She searched her own memory for the crime she must have committed to deserve this kind of erasing. But almost nobody notices what happens next. 2 years later, Elena opened a small design studio in Austin, something she had wanted to do since she was 19 years old, but had quietly put on hold every single year she was with Daniel, because his career, his schedule, his dreams always came first. Not because he demanded it, because she offered it, without even realizing she was doing it. It wasn't until the relationship ended that Eleanor understood something devastating and beautiful at the same time. She had not lost her future when Daniel left. She had been living inside someone else's future the entire time. And the ending, as unbearable as it felt in that kitchen, was the only thing that could have returned her own life back to her. This is where the story changes. Because Eleanor's ending wasn't a punishment, it was a return. Psychologists have a word for what happened to Eleanor in that relationship. They call it enmeshment, the slow dissolving of your own identity into someone else's until you can no longer tell where you end and they begin. It happens to lovers. It happens to friends. It happens to children who spend decades trying to become the person their parents needed them to be, instead of the person they actually are. And when enmeshment breaks, it does not feel like freedom. It feels like death. Because in a very real way, a version of you does die. The version that existed only in relation to someone else. The version that borrowed its worth from another person's attention. But something else is always born in that same moment, quietly, without ceremony. A self that was buried underneath years of accommodation, finally given air to breathe again. The hardest truth is still ahead. Stay with me. Let's talk about Marcus. Marcus was 17 years old when his father left. Not through death, through choice. One morning his father's car simply wasn't in the driveway anymore, and it never returned. For years, Marcus built a version of himself designed entirely around proving his worth to a man who was no longer watching. He became the top student in his class, captain of the debate team, the kind of son who collected achievements like armor, hoping that somewhere, somehow, his father would hear about them and feel the sting of what he had walked away from. At 26, Marcus finally saw his father again, at a cousin's wedding neither of them could avoid. And in that brief, awkward conversation by the punch bowl, Marcus realized something that broke him wide open. His father wasn't haunted. His father wasn't tortured by guilt, wasn't secretly proud from a distance, wasn't the tragic, complicated figure Marcus had spent a decade constructing in his imagination. His father was simply a man who had made a choice and moved on and built an entirely different life with an entirely different family without a single backward glance. For years, Marcus believed his father's absence was proof of his own inadequacy. That night, driving home from the wedding, he understood the truth for the first time. His father's leaving had never been a verdict on Marcus's worth. It had only ever been a reflection of his father's own limitations. Some people leave not because you weren't enough. They leave because they were never capable of staying for anyone, no matter how remarkable that person was. This is a truth that echoes through nearly every kind of abandonment. The empty chair at the table doesn't always mean you are unworthy of being seated beside. Sometimes it simply means the other person never learned how to sit still long enough to stay anywhere. Marcus spent years chasing his father's silence, when he could have been listening to his own life, quietly asking him to stop waiting at a door that was never going to open again. That is when the silence begins to make sense. Let's step back for a moment, because there is a larger pattern hiding underneath every one of these stories, and once you see it, you will not be able to unsee it. Human beings are wired for attachment. From the moment we are born, our nervous systems are built to bond, to cling, to search for safety in the presence of another person. This is not weakness. This is biology. This is the oldest survival mechanism we have. A baby left alone in the wilderness does not survive. So we are built, cell by cell, to fear being left. But here is the paradox almost nobody names out loud. The same wiring that keeps us alive as infants can quietly sabotage us as adults when we mistake attachment for identity. When we start to believe that our worth is measured by who chooses to remain beside us, and our brokenness is measured by who chooses to walk away. This is why an ending doesn't just hurt like sadness, it hurts like an earthquake. Because it isn't only the other person leaving, it's the structure of your identity, the one you built around their presence, collapsing along with them. But structures can be rebuilt, and sometimes the ones we rebuild after collapse are far stronger than the ones that fell. Think of a river carving through solid stone. It does not ask the stone for permission. It does not apologize for reshaping the landscape. Over thousands of years, the river simply keeps moving, and the canyon it leaves behind becomes one of the most breathtaking things human eyes will ever witness. The Grand Canyon is not evidence of destruction. It is evidence of patience, of erosion working slowly enough that beauty had time to form. Your life is doing the same thing to you right now, even in this very moment. Every ending is a kind of erosion, painful, slow, sometimes unbearable. But it is also, quietly, carving something in you that could never have existed without the wearing away of what used to be there. Stay with me, because the next realization changes everything. Let's talk about Yuki. Yuki was 61 years old when her closest friend of 32 years stopped speaking to her over a disagreement so small that neither of them, years later, could fully remember what started it. A comment at a dinner party, a misunderstanding about money, some minor wound that, left untreated, festered into a silence that neither woman knew how to break. For 3 years, Yuki carried the weight of that friendship like a stone in her chest. She wrote letters she never sent. She rehearsed apologies for things she wasn't even sure she had done. She mourned not just the friend, but the decades of memory that friend represented. Every wedding, every hospital waiting room, every ordinary Tuesday phone call about nothing at all. And then, in the 4th year, something shifted. Yuki joined a pottery class, mostly to fill the empty hours that friendship used to occupy. In that class, she met a group of women in their 60s and 70s, all of them carrying their own quiet griefs, their own empty chairs. And in the slow, patient shaping of clay on a spinning wheel, Yuki found something she had not expected, a new kind of belonging. Not a replacement for what was lost, but an entirely different shape of connection, one that could never have formed if the old friendship had remained intact, filling up all the space where this new one needed to grow. Yuki told me something months later that I have never forgotten. She said, "I used to think losing her meant I had failed at loving someone for 32 years. Now I think I succeeded at loving her for exactly as long as we were meant to walk together. And when that road ended, my life built me a new one, and I almost didn't notice, because I was too busy grieving the old path to see the new one already forming beneath my feet." This is the part of the story that almost nobody wants to hear, because it requires letting go of something we cling to instinctively. The idea that the length of a relationship determines its value. That if something doesn't last forever, it must have failed. But some relationships are not built to last forever. Some are built to last exactly as long as they are needed, and then to release you, gently or violently, into whatever comes next. This is where the story changes. Let's talk about identity for a moment, because underneath every ending is the same trembling question. Who am I now that they're gone? There is a concept in psychology called the looking glass self, the idea that we come to understand who we are largely through the reflection of how others see us. We become, in part, the person our parents believed us to be, the partner our lover saw in us, the friend our best friend needed us to become. This is not inherently unhealthy. It is how human beings develop, through relationship, through mirroring, through connection. But it becomes dangerous when the mirror becomes the only place we recognize ourselves. Because when that mirror shatters, when that person walks away, we are left standing in the wreckage asking a terrifying question. If they were the one who saw me, who sees me now? This is the real work of every ending. Not simply surviving the loss of the other person, but rebuilding your own eyes. Learning to see yourself without needing someone else's gaze to confirm you exist. Let me tell you about David. David was 44 years old, and he had spent 20 years building a company with his best friend since college, a man named Theo. They started with nothing, 2 folding tables in a garage, and built a business that eventually employed over 200 people. Their friendship and their identity had become so completely fused with the company that David genuinely could not have told you, if you had asked him, where Theo the friend ended and Theo the business partner began. And then, after a disagreement about the company's direction, Theo bought David out. Legally, cleanly, with lawyers and paperwork, and none of the warmth that had built the company in the first place. Just like that, David lost his best friend and his life's work in the same afternoon. For over a year, David could not answer a simple question at dinner parties. What do you do? Because the honest answer, the company, wasn't his anymore, and neither was the friendship that had defined half his adult life. But in that unbearable blankness, something began to take shape. David started mentoring young entrepreneurs, something Theo had never had time or patience for. He discovered, slowly, that his gift had never actually been the company itself. It had been the guiding, the teaching, the quiet wisdom he offered younger founders who reminded him of who he used to be. The company had only ever been the container. His actual gift had been waiting inside him the whole time, hidden underneath 20 years of assuming his identity and Theo's business were the same thing. David once said something to me that captured this entire truth in a single sentence. He said, "I thought I lost my life's work. What I actually lost was the wrapping paper. The gift was still inside me the whole time." Stay with me, because the next part is the part that changes how you see every goodbye you have ever survived. There is an old idea, found in nearly every culture, in nearly every philosophical tradition throughout human history, that nature does not tolerate a vacuum. Empty space, left alone long enough, begins to fill itself. A field left fallow does not stay barren forever. Wildflowers arrive, uninvited, and claim the ground. Human lives operate the same way. When someone leaves, when a door closes, when a dream collapses, we experience the immediate aftermath as devastating emptiness. But emptiness is not the end of the story. Emptiness is simply unclaimed potential, waiting to be filled by something that could not have entered while the old thing still occupied the space. This is not a guarantee that something better always arrives. Life is not a fairy tale, and this is not a promise that every ending leads directly to something beautiful. Some griefs simply hurt, without any silver lining attached, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But there is a difference between pretending pain doesn't exist and refusing to believe that pain is the final chapter. Because here is the deeper truth hiding beneath every one of these stories. The ache you feel after losing someone is not proof that the universe made a mistake. It is proof that you are capable of loving deeply enough to be shattered by an absence. And that capacity, The very same nervous system that aches in grief is the same capacity that will one day let you love again, build again, hope again. The hardest truth is still ahead. Let's talk about Sarah, because her story might be the one that breaks your heart open the widest. Sarah was 29 years old when her mother, the person who raised her single-handedly after her father left when Sarah was 4, was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer. For 11 months, Sarah watched the strongest woman she had ever known slowly disappear into a hospital bed. She held her mother's hand through chemotherapy. She memorized the sound of the machines that monitored her mother's heartbeat, the particular rhythm of hope and fear that lived inside that beeping. And then, on a Thursday in early spring, her mother was gone. Sarah told me that in the weeks after the funeral, she kept reaching for her phone to call her mother about the smallest things. A recipe she couldn't remember, a joke only her mother would understand. And every single time, the realization landed again, fresh and unbearable, that the person on the other end of that call no longer existed anywhere she could reach. For a long time, Sarah believed that grief this large meant she would never feel whole again. That losing her mother had removed a piece of her that could never be replaced. And she was right. It could never be replaced. But 2 years later, Sarah told me something that reframed everything I understood about loss. She said that in the process of grieving her mother, she had finally learned to mother herself. All the patience her mother used to offer her, the gentleness, the reassurance, Sarah had slowly, painfully learned to offer to herself, because there was no longer anyone else to provide it. Her mother's death had forced her into an adulthood of the soul that nothing else could have taught her. She said, "I would give anything to have her back, but I also know that the woman I am now, the one who can comfort herself, who trusts her own voice, who doesn't need anyone's permission to be okay, she was born in the exact moment my mother stopped being able to comfort me. I hate that it happened this way, and I am also, somehow, grateful for who I became because it did." This is the part of the story where everything begins to come together. Not every ending is gentle. Some are the cruelest thing a life can hand you. But even inside the cruelest endings, something is often quietly forming. Not to justify the pain, not to make it acceptable, but to remind you that pain and growth are not opposites. They are, more often than we want to admit, traveling companions. Now let's talk about letting go, because this is where the story finally turns toward the light. There is a particular kind of person who appears in almost every one of these stories eventually. The person who finally, after months or years of gripping tightly to what used to be, opens their hand and lets it go. Letting go does not mean stopping love. It does not mean pretending the person or the dream or the relationship never mattered. Letting go means something much quieter and much braver. It means accepting that a chapter has ended without demanding that the book itself be destroyed. Think of an old photograph, faded at the edges, kept in a drawer for years. You do not have to burn the photograph to move forward. You simply have to stop expecting it to still be a living, breathing part of your present. The photograph can stay, it can even be beautiful, but it belongs to the past tense now, and peace arrives the moment you stop trying to force it back into the present tense. This is where most people get stuck, not in the loss itself, but in the refusal to let the loss become the past. We keep the door slightly open, hoping the person will walk back through it. We keep rehearsing the version of events where things ended differently. We keep asking why, as though the right answer might somehow reverse what has already happened. But almost nobody notices what happens the moment you finally close that door, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with something closer to gratitude. The moment you close it, your hands become free again. And only free hands can build something new. And that's when the silence begins to make sense. Let's return for a moment to the metaphor of the tree in October, because now you have the context to understand it fully. The tree does not fight the falling leaves. It does not curse the wind for stripping away what once felt like its entire identity. It simply lets go, season after season, trusting something it cannot see or prove. That spring is coming, that the bareness is not the end of its story. That what looks like loss to anyone watching from the outside is actually the tree's ancient, wordless wisdom in motion. We are not so different from that tree. We just forget, in the middle of our own particular winter, that winter has never once, in the history of this planet, failed to end. Now I want to tell you about the last story, because it is the one that ties every other story together, and it might be the one that feels the most like your own. There was a man named Aaron, 68 years old, who spent 40 years of his life in the same small manufacturing job, the same small town, married to the same woman for 39 of those years. When his wife passed away after a long illness, Aaron believed, with complete certainty, that his life was effectively over. Everyone he had built his identity around, his wife, his job that closed 2 years later, his children who had long since moved across the country to build lives of their own, all of it seemed to be dissolving at once, as though the universe had decided, cruelly and without explanation, to dismantle everything Aaron had spent his whole life constructing. For a year, Aaron barely left his house. He told his daughter, in a phone call she still remembers word for word, that he felt like a man standing in the wreckage of a life that no longer had any use for him. But his daughter said something to him that day that Aaron has repeated to me more than once. She said, "Dad, maybe the universe isn't punishing you. Maybe it's just clearing the table. And I know it's terrifying to sit at an empty table, but you can't set a new plate down until the old one is cleared away." Aaron didn't understand what she meant, not really, not for months. But slowly, almost against his own will, he began volunteering at a community garden 2 blocks from his house. He had never gardened a single day in his life, and in that garden, in the dirt under his fingernails, in the particular satisfaction of watching something grow from a seed he had planted with his own trembling hands, Aaron discovered a version of himself that had been dormant for 68 years, buried underneath decades of routine, responsibility, and a life that, however loving, had never once asked him what he actually wanted. At 71 years old, Aaron told me, with tears in his eyes that he did not try to hide, that he had never in his entire life felt more like himself than he did standing in that garden, hands in the soil, surrounded by people 40 years younger than him, who had somehow become his closest friends. He said, "Everyone I loved leaving, one by one, felt like the universe was erasing me. It took me years to understand it wasn't erasing me. It was making room for a version of me I never would have met otherwise." This is the sentence that every single story we have told tonight has been circling, quietly, from the very first breath of this video until now. The people who leave you are not always taking your future away. Sometimes, without meaning to, without even knowing it, they are making room for a future that could never have existed if they had stayed. This does not mean every ending is secretly a gift wrapped in cruelty. Some endings are simply losses, and they deserve to be grieved fully, without rushing toward a silver lining that isn't ready to be found yet. Healing is not a race, and this is not a video telling you to skip the grief and jump straight to gratitude. Grieve as long and as deeply as you need to. Grief is not weakness. Grief is love with nowhere left to go. But somewhere on the other side of that grief, if you are patient with yourself, if you allow the process to move at its own pace instead of forcing it, you will eventually arrive at a strange and unexpected kind of peace. Not because the pain stops mattering, but because you finally understand that the pain was never proof of your unworthiness. It was proof of your capacity to love, and that capacity was never lost, even in the moment it felt most broken. Think about every empty train station you have ever stood in, waiting for someone who was never coming back. Think about every locked door you have knocked on, hoping it would somehow open one more time. Think about every bridge that quietly collapsed behind you, cutting off a version of your life you thought you would live in forever. None of those endings were proof that you were too much, or not enough, or somehow unworthy of being chosen. Some of them were proof that certain roads are only meant to carry you part way, before handing you off to a different road entirely, one you couldn't have found if the first one had never ended. The rain that falls before sunrise feels, in the moment, like it will never stop. It feels like darkness with no bottom, like a storm that has forgotten how to end. But it always ends. And when it does, the sky it leaves behind is somehow clearer than it was before the storm arrived, as though the rain itself had been quietly washing something away, preparing the horizon for a light that couldn't have broken through otherwise. You are allowed to miss what you lost. You are allowed to wish some nights that things had gone differently. You are allowed to still feel the weight of an empty chair at your table, or an unanswered message on your phone, or a version of your own life you thought you would be living by now. But you are also allowed to imagine, just for a moment, that none of it happened to punish you. That perhaps quietly, in ways you couldn't understand while you were living inside the pain, your life was clearing a table, making room for a plate you hadn't even designed yet, preparing space for a version of you that the old chapter, however beautiful it once was, could never have made room for. One day, you'll stop asking why they left, because you'll finally see that the life waiting for you needed room to arrive. And perhaps the greatest gift the universe ever gave you was the courage to keep walking after the goodbye. So tonight, before you close this video and return to whatever life is quietly rebuilding itself around you, I want to leave you with one question. Not an answer, just a question, the kind that stays with you long after the screen goes dark. What if the empty space in your life right now isn't a wound at all, but a room, patiently waiting for the person you are still becoming?